The smell of burning could be felt for many miles before the rescue team reached the epicenter. On Borneo, the fire season turns the jungle into an orange hell, where smoke becomes denser than air, and the cries of animals drown in the crackling of dry brush devoured by flames. When the volunteer team from the Wild Roots organization broke through to the charred clearing that had become a mass grave for ancient trees, they didn't hope to find anything alive there. Ash covered the ground with a gray shroud, and in this dead silence the sound of a weak, barely audible squeak seemed like a hallucination. Mark, an experienced veterinarian who had been through dozens of similar missions, was the first to notice a tiny red spot under a fallen ironwood trunk. It was a baby orangutan who appeared to be no more than 4 months old. He clutched a piece of charred bark in his paws so tightly, as if it were the only thread connecting him to life. There was no mother nearby. In the world of orangutans, this meant only one thing. She died protecting him while she still had the strength to flee from the fire. The baby, who would later be named Benny, looked like a living skeleton covered with sparse, soot-stained fur. His eyes, huge and amber, were clouded by a veil of deepest shock. When Mark tried to pick him up, Benny didn't even resist. He had no strength for fear, no strength to cry. He simply went limp, continuing to convulsively clutch his piece of bark. "He's slipping away," Mark said quietly to his assistant Sarah when they were already racing in an old SUV toward the rehabilitation center. "This isn't just dehydration or burns. This is broken heart syndrome. He's given up." At the Wild Roots Center, a battle for life began that seemed lost from the first second. Benny was placed in a sterile box, surrounded by warm heating pads imitating the warmth of a mother's body, and they tried to feed him. But here the volunteers faced the worst nightmare of any rescuer. The orangutan refused food. He clenched his jaws tightly when a bottle with nutritional formula was brought to his lips. He turned away from ripe pieces of papaya and bananas, which usually drive any primate crazy. 3 days passed. Benny's weight, already critical, continued to drop. Mark and Sarah took shifts on duty, changing the IVs that barely kept life in this tiny body. Benny just lay there, staring at one point above him. In his gaze there was no interest in the world, no pain, only infinite, icy emptiness. He was voluntarily fading away, having decided to follow his mother into that darkness from which they had pulled him. "We've tried everything," Sarah lamented, feeling tears of helplessness welling up in her eyes. "We gave him antidepressants. We played jungle sounds. We even brought him a plush toy that looked like an adult female. He didn't even look at it. Mark, if he doesn't eat in the next 12 hours, his organs will start to fail." Mark sat in the corner of the box, looking at the small creature that was once supposed to become the king of these forests. He knew the statistics. Baby orangutans are so socially dependent that their psyche breaks before their body does. For Benny, the world ceased to exist the moment his mother's warm hands unclenched in the smoke of the fire. For him, any food, any human touch was alien, false, meaningless. That night, silence fell over the rehabilitation center, interrupted only by the hum of fans. Mark didn't go home. He sat on the concrete floor next to Benny's cage, looking at the plate with sliced mango that remained untouched. Suddenly, a crazy, absolutely unscientific and even dangerous from a protocol standpoint idea flashed in his head. He remembered research on mirror neurons and how primates rate emotions not through actions, but through empathy. Mark realized that all this time they had been acting like doctors, like guardians, like higher beings trying to save an object. But Benny didn't need a doctor. He didn't need a human with a bottle. He needed someone who would share his fate. Mark slowly stood up, walked to the medicine cabinet, and took out a jar of special high-calorie paste for primates. He took off his medical coat, remaining in a simple t-shirt, and entered Benny's enclosure. Sarah, watching this through a monitor in the next room, froze, not understanding what he had planned. Instead of once again trying to shove food into the baby's mouth, Mark sat down in a dusty corner of the enclosure, right on the straw, and froze. He assumed the same position in which Benny lay, curled up in a ball, pulling his knees to his chin. He began to make quiet, hoarse sounds, imitating the cry of an orangutan who had lost his family. Benny moved for the first time in several days. His eyelid trembled. He slowly turned his head and looked at this large, strange creature that wasn't trying to treat him, but seemed to be suffering just as he was. Mark opened the jar of paste, scooped up the thick mass with his finger, and looking Benny straight in the eyes, began to eat it himself. He did this slowly, with obvious effort, showing that each swallow was a struggle, but a struggle that must be won. He didn't offer food to Benny. He just ate nearby, transmitting with every cell of his body a single emotion. I'm the same as you. I'm scared too, but I'm eating to survive. The silence in the enclosure became ringing. Benny watched Mark, and something began to change in his amber eyes. The ice of despair that had bound his brain gave its first crack. The baby slowly, millimeter by millimeter, reached out with his thin, trembling paw toward the human's hand. But he wasn't asking for food. He touched Mark's finger, stained with paste, and froze for a moment. At that moment in the rehabilitation center, time seemed to stop. Mark stopped breathing, afraid to scare away this fragile contact. Benny brought Mark's finger to his nose, sniffed it, and then, barely noticeably licked the remains of the nutritional mixture. This was the baby's first independent action in a week. This was the first sign that the will to live, buried under the ashes of Borneo, was still smoldering somewhere deep inside. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He realized he had found the key, but he didn't yet know what price he would have to pay to fully bring Benny back from the world of shadows. After all, this was only the beginning of a long and painful journey, on which one mistake could negate everything achieved. The next 2 weeks turned into an exhausting marathon. Mark practically stopped leaving the enclosure, becoming for Benny a strange, clumsy, but only support. The empathy method worked. The baby began to accept food, but only from Mark's hands, and only if the veterinarian ate with him. This was a victory, but a very fragile one. Benny was still panically afraid of sudden sounds and any presence of other people. As soon as Sarah or another staff member approached the mesh, the baby would fall into catatonia, retreating into a corner and covering his head with his paws. His physical wounds were healing. His fur gradually began to acquire a healthy copper hue, but the psychological trauma was too deep. Mark understood. He couldn't forever substitute for Benny's mother. Moreover, attachment to a human at such an age could be a death sentence for the orangutan. He would never be able to return to the wild if he didn't learn to be a monkey. "We've created a monster of dependency," Mark stated at the morning briefing, looking at the dark circles under his eyes. "He eats, he grows, but he's not developing. He doesn't play, doesn't climb. He just waits for me. If I disappear, he'll die in 2 days. We need to transfer him to forest school, but he won't survive there. The older orphans will simply crush him." The forest school at the center housed dozens of rescued orangutans of different ages. There they learned to build nests, search for termites, and distinguish edible fruits from poisonous ones. It was a rigid, hierarchical structure. Benny, with his broken psyche, would become an outcast there. However, fate prepared a new twist for this story. At the same time, a large-scale operation was conducted in the northern sector of the island to seize animals from the illegal home zoo of a local official. Among the confiscated primates was Bella, an adult female orangutan who had spent almost 8 years in a cramped cage. She had no offspring. Her body was deformed due to lack of movement, and her gaze expressed the same frozen longing as Benny's in the first days. When Bella was brought to the center, she was aggressive and wouldn't let anyone near her. But Mark noticed a strange detail. Every time food for the babies was carried past her enclosure, she would freeze and make a quiet, guttural sound, the call of a mother who never had a child. The idea came spontaneously, and it was risky. The integration of an adult, traumatized female and an orphaned baby is a lottery. In nature, orangutans are loners, and someone else's baby can become either a burden or an object of aggression for a female. "We'll try to introduce them," Mark said decisively, "through the bars. If she shows interest, we'll open the door. If not, we'll have to separate them with water cannons." D-Day came. Benny, pressed against Mark's chest, trembled all over. When he was brought to Bella's enclosure, she sat in the farthest corner, turned away to the wall. Mark carefully lowered the baby onto the floor in front of the partition. Benny, sensing the smell of another orangutan, real, wild, animal smell, suddenly fell silent. Bella slowly turned around. she saw a tiny creature that looked even more miserable than herself. There was a steel mesh between them, but their gazes met. For several minutes, there was deathly silence in the corridor. Sarah held a tranquilizer at the ready. Mark didn't take his hand off the bolt. Suddenly, Bella approached the mesh and extended her long finger, scarred from chains. She touched Benny's forehead. The baby didn't recoil. Instead, he made a sound that Mark had never heard, a thin, vibrating call for help. Bella responded with a quiet growl. "Open it," Mark commanded in a whisper. The door between the enclosures slowly crawled upward. What happened next made Sarah cover her mouth with her hand to keep from crying out. Bella didn't rush at Benny. She slowly lowered herself onto all fours, closing the distance, and simply opened her huge embrace. Benny, as if guided by ancient instinct, rushed to her and buried himself in her thick fur. They sat like that for hours. Two broken creatures, two fragments of a destroyed forest, found in each other what no human could give, an understanding of common pain. Bella began to groom Benny, carefully removing specks from his red coat, and he fell asleep for the first time in all this time with a deep, peaceful sleep, not waking up from every rustle. It seemed like the perfect ending, but ahead of them was a trial for which no one was prepared. A month later, the idyll was disrupted. A powerful tropical storm broke out in the area of the center. Thunder, reminiscent of the sounds of explosions and the crackling of falling trees during the fire, triggered a severe panic attack in Benny. He began to beat against the walls of the enclosure, screaming in terror. Bella tried to calm him, but Benny's fear was stronger. At some point, having lost his orientation, he ran out through the open door of the service corridor, which an inexperienced intern had forgotten to lock. The baby ran out into the pouring rain, toward the dense jungle surrounding the center. "Benny, come back!" Mark shouted, running after him. But the orangutan, driven by primordial terror of the fire thunder, had already disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Finding a tiny monkey in the night jungle during a downpour is an impossible task. Mark and a group of volunteers combed the perimeter until morning, using thermal imagers and powerful flashlights. But the forest seemed to have swallowed Benny. By morning, the storm subsided, leaving behind only the smell of wet earth and oppressive silence. Mark stood at the edge of the forest, realizing that without food and protection, Benny wouldn't last even a day. But the worst thing was something else. Bella, left alone in the enclosure, fell into apathy again. She refused to go out for a walk and just sat, looking in the direction where her adopted son had run. "We've lost both of them," Sarah said dully, lowering her head. However, Mark noticed something strange. Bella began to make a strange, rhythmic sound, like a drum roll. She beat her palms on the floor of the enclosure, creating a vibration that spread far around the area. It was a signal. She wasn't just calling him, she was showing the way home. And an hour later, something appeared from the dense fern thicket. It was Benny. He was covered in mud, scratched, soaked to the bone, but he was walking toward the sound. He didn't just return. There was no previous constraint in his movements. This escape into the wild forest, which had become a nightmare for everyone, unexpectedly awakened a hidden strength in him. When he returned to Bella's embrace, Mark saw on his little face not fear, but something like determination. From that day on, rehabilitation went according to a different scenario. Benny no longer needed Mark as a surrogate mom. He had Bella, and he had the forest, which he stopped being afraid of. 2 years passed. The day came that all the Wild Roots staff both awaited and feared. Release day. The process of returning to the wild for orangutans is a long journey that ends in remote sections of protected forest. The cages were loaded onto a raft that was to take Bella and Benny deep into the island, to where the human voice is heard only in exceptional cases. When they arrived at the place, Mark personally opened the lock. Bella came out first. She confidently grabbed a hanging vine and in several powerful movements climbed to the lower tier of the forest. Benny, already a strong teenager with a thick mane, followed her. He stopped at a height of 5 meters and turned around. Mark stood below, on the deck of the raft. He knew that primates cannot be anthropomorphized, that they don't feel gratitude in our understanding. But at that moment, Benny did something that wasn't written in any biology textbook. He momentarily released the branch with one hand and placed his palm on his heart. as Mark had done in those long nights in the enclosure, when he tried to show the baby that he wasn't alone. This was a farewell gesture. The orangutans disappeared into the thick foliage, and only the rustle of branches reminded that a miracle had just happened here. Another 5 years passed. Mark rarely went on field missions anymore, doing administrative work at the center. But one day, he received a message from a group of researchers who were installing camera traps in the far sector of the reserve, hundreds of miles from the release site. "Mark, you need to see this," said a voice on the phone. In the sent photograph, taken in the rays of the setting sun, at the top of a huge tree sat an adult, stately female orangutan. Bella could be recognized in her features, aged but free, and next to her, on a neighboring branch, sat a massive male with powerful cheek pads, a true king of the forest. It was Benny. But the most amazing thing wasn't that. On Benny's back, clinging to his thick fur, sat a tiny, newborn baby. And this was incredible. A male orangutan, contrary to all laws of biology, wasn't just nearby. He was protecting this small creature, allowing it to feel safe. Benny, who had once refused life on the ashes, now himself became the keeper of new life. He didn't just survive. He brought love and care to where nature prescribes only the struggle for existence. He remembered the lesson received from the human and his adoptive mother. Life continues as long as there is someone willing to share your pain and your silence. Mark looked at the monitor screen, and the tears he had held back for so many years finally rolled down his cheeks. His work was complete. The story that began in smoke and ash ended in the triumph of life under the green canopy of the eternal forest.